Hi everyone, welcome to the University of Leicester's Digital Open Day. My name is Dr. Matt Wild and I'm a lecturer in human geography here in the School of Geography, Geology and the Environment. What I'm going to do today is talk you through some of my research in order to demonstrate how teaching and research very much overlaps at the University of Leicester, and to give you a sample of the kinds of teaching you're likely to get from the research active community that I'm a part of here at Leicester. Okay, so what I want to do today is think about the relationship between energy and society, and I'm going to do this by looking at the country in which I've worked for the last decade or so, since 2008, which is Venezuela, based in Latin America. So I'm going to provide a brief history of the relationship between Venezuela and its oil economy. And then I'm going to think about some of the ways in which oil economies shape and influence the social life of particular countries. So we're going to think about boom and bust, and how periods of boom and bust in economic terms can ripple out and shape wider spheres of social life in particular societies, and in this case talking about Venezuela. And I'm going to wrap up with some conclusions about what this tells us about oil economies and how they relate to the societies in which they are situated. So this is a sample of human geography and the way that some human geographers like to think about and analyse energy, society and nature. Okay, so I want to say a few things about myself. My name is Matt Wild. I received my PhD from the London School of Economics and Political Science in 2013. The images that you can see are some images from my fieldwork in Venezuela, which I'm still in the process of doing. I'm the one in the middle there, next to the guy with the red jacket. I've been working in Venezuela since 2008, as I said, and I'm interested in the relationship between what we call macro-social forces, so the kind of big global forces that act upon national governments and act beneath national governments, and what we might call micro-social realities, so the ways in which people's everyday lives are shaped by these big global forces. So many human geographers work across multiple scales, and that's very much what I do, is trying to see the relationship between the macro and the micro. And the ways in which I do this is through a research method known as ethnography, which translates as people writing, but more specifically it involves long-term participant observation in a given social setting. So an ethnographer inserts themselves into the everyday lives of the people and the societies that they are interested in, and they do so for a long period of time. So usually for at least 18 months, in order to learn the language, in order to learn the kind of cultural norms of a given place, and in order to really embed yourself in a given society. So that's what I've been doing in Venezuela since 2008. And the idea of ethnography is that you come to see patterns in social life, and by analysing those patterns you start to see some of the underlying forces that shape people's lives, sometimes without them being realising it themselves. So I've been doing this research in Venezuela, as I said, for around a decade, and often when we think about oil, particularly in the present moment, we tend to think about climate change. The clip on the left of your screen there is a cutting from the Guardian newspaper, which shows the 20 largest polluters, so the 20 firms that are behind the majority of carbon emissions. And if you go down the list there, you can see that almost all of these companies are oil companies, and many of them are state-owned oil companies. It is quite common across the world for national governments to take over control of their extractive industries, particularly oil and gas, in order to maximise the income that their states can receive from the oil export of their energy. So in the case of Venezuela, oil has been nationalized since 1976 and is the predominant source of national income. It makes up about 93% of GDP. So in the present era, where we're becoming increasingly aware of climate change and of the problems surrounding climate change, discussions about energy almost always centre on carbon emissions, on pollution. But I think it's also important that we need to think about how energy sources have many other impacts on societies writ large. So it's not just climate change which poses a problem, but it's also the fact that being based around a single resource can often produce distortions and imbalances in the economic lives of given economies and of given nation states, and that this can have a wider impact on the political, social and cultural lives of particular societies. So these are the questions that I'm interested in, and this is why I started working in Venezuela in 2008. What I wanted to know was, well, what might be the pros and cons of being a resource-rich country in different parts of the world? And there's a long history of inequality in our world, and countries in the global south have often struggled to make the most of their resources because they're in a dependent position in the global economy as a result of colonialism and the history that's followed since colonialism. So I was interested in, well, what happens when a country like Venezuela tries to make the most of its resources, in this case oil. Now, many countries who find themselves in the position of having a single or a handful of particular resources struggle to make the most of those resources. And it's often been debated by development economists, by sociologists, by anthropologists, the question of whether oil is a blessing or a curse, particularly for countries that aren't necessarily all that wealthy. So in some instances, oil has enabled nation states to become extremely rich. So if you think about places like Norway or places like Saudi Arabia, they've managed to use oil reserves to create what we call sovereign wealth funds. So these are investment vehicles that pull the money from oil exports and then transform that into other forms of wealth by investing in many different things. So Saudi Arabia very famously invests in real estate, invests in all kinds of things across the world. And you can see the image on the right there of different sovereign wealth funds and the success that particular states like Norway and Saudi Arabia have had in transforming their oil wealth into a wider sense of wealth and a wider ability to meet the needs of their populations. In many other cases, however, particularly in the global south, nation states have struggled to make the most of the income that they receive for their oil exports. And there are many complicated reasons for this struggle. But it's often termed the resource curse. So it's the idea that particular states, often states who have only gained independence in the last 150 years or so, have struggled to build the institutional frameworks in which to manage the wealth that comes from their oil exports. And this has led to various other problems in the economy and in their societies. So to just explain this idea of the resource curse in a bit more detail, if you look at this from the left to right, so when you have countries discover that they have oil, the first thing they do is often invite in foreign oil companies who help them develop the capacity to extract that oil. Once they've got the capacity to do so, you'll start to see the influx of foreign currencies in order to finance those operations. Now, many national governments will then deliberately overvalue their currencies, so they'll artificially fix them higher than they would be if they were left to float, in order to maximise the income that they can receive when they export their oil. So the higher the currency, the more dollars you'll receive in. These are often called petrodollars. Now, on the one hand, this means that petrostates receive a huge amount of money when they send their oil out to other countries and export it around the world. But this also creates a situation whereby people and capital move from other sectors of their economies to the oil sector. And it also means that these other sectors, so it might be agriculture or other forms of industry, grow less competitive. And when you have an overvalued currency, it makes it much harder for you to export other materials. So whether that's coffee or sugar or other extractive industries, they can't compete on the global market because they've got this artificially high currency. So what's the impact of that on the society as a whole? Well, to give you a brief history of Venezuela, the image on the right there is of the Venezuelan state oil company, which is called PDVSA. And you can see this is a worker from PDVSA who is pumping oil money down into this sort of bag. And inside that bag, it's the Bolivarian government of Venezuela, so the national government. And that national government is then filtering down this oil money into various parts of the country. And the headline here says, "The black gold comes out of the subsoil direct for the people." So this is the idea that by nationalising the oil company, the national government of Venezuela has the ability to use oil money to develop the country in various different ways. Now, since the 1920s, when oil was discovered in Venezuela, this has in many ways been the foundational myth of the entire country. So oil has come to shape the country's economy, its politics, and its culture in very profound ways. Fernando Coronel, who's a Venezuelan anthropologist, has written about this extensively in a book called The Magical State. Now, on the one hand, this created a national belief in oil, that it had this kind of transformative power to bring prosperity to the nation as a whole. But on the other, it also created many contradictions. So when you have an economy dependent on oil, it becomes acutely vulnerable to the rise and fall of world oil prices. And this is particularly the case for post-colonial states like Venezuela, who are in a dependent position in the global economy and have historically seen their wealth extracted by the global north. So when they were a colony of Spain, Venezuela obviously saw much of its wealth disappear to the Spanish. And more recently, the US has had many economic, political influences on Venezuela, which many in the country regard as being somewhat exploitative. So that's Venezuela. So how is it that as an ethnographer, I try and understand the impact of oil on Venezuelan society as a whole? Well, as I said, what ethnographers do is we insert ourselves into the everyday lives of the places we're interested in, and in doing so, attempt to understand these wider social forces as they kind of ripple out into people's lives. So the question I asked at the start of my PhD over a decade ago was, how are periods of boom and bust experienced in everyday life? And what impact does an oil economy have on things like local level politics, on things like personal aspirations, family structures, and livelihood strategies? Now, Venezuela, like much of Latin America, is a deeply unequal society where at least 60% of the population live in relative poverty. So I was interested in the kind of social dynamics that were often overlooked by the kind of macro level approaches to oil and society. I wanted to understand how we could get beyond the resource curse and understand oil as something which filtered out into everyday life and shaped people's lives in profound ways. So what I did, and what I've been doing since 2008, was move to Venezuela, and I spent almost 2 years there for my doctoral research between 2008 and 2010, and I've then since been back in 2012 and 2017. The image on the bottom left there is an image of a house that I have lived in. Whenever I go back, I've got a Venezuelan family who've adopted me, and I stay with those guys and kind of make a nuisance of myself in their community by asking lots of questions and doing interviews and trying to observe everyday social life as much as possible. Right, so moving on to the kind of more recent history that I've looked at in Venezuela. In 1998, they elected a new president, which is this gentleman on the left-hand side of your screen. He was called Hugo Chavez. He died in 2013. But when Chavez was elected, it was a huge change in the way that Venezuelan politics and democracy worked. He was a left-of-centre former army colonel who positioned himself against the country's elite. and was rhetorically very famous for his sort of anti-American, anti-US sentiments. He claimed that what he wanted to do was regain control over Venezuela's oil wealth and use it to provide support to the country's poor majority in a way that hadn't happened in the previous 2 decades. Like many countries in Latin America and the global south, Venezuela had suffered extreme inequality and many social problems throughout the 1980s and 90s as a result of debt obligations imposed on them by the global north. Okay, so Chavez's arrival into the seat of power in Venezuela coincided with a rapid and steady rise in oil prices. So if you look at the graph there, from around the early 2000s onwards, world oil prices rose steadily up until 2008, and then you have this huge drop. Now that was the global financial crisis, which many of you will know about. And then it starts to rise again once the world economy starts to recover, and then peaks again, not as high as it had been, but in 2014, just before 2014. So under Chavez's rule, the government embarked on a huge spending spree and used this influx of petrodollars to try and address many of the social problems that the country faced. So social expenditure in Venezuela increased 5-fold per inhabitant during the 2000s, so from around 2003 onwards. So between 2003 and 2007, the number of Venezuelan households in poverty was halved from 54% to 27.5%, while extreme poverty fell from 25.1% of the population to 7.6%. So these are really significant changes in people's ability to lead kind of meaningful and workable lives for themselves. Now, in my local community, many of the things that I was investigating evolved around funding for new projects which came directly from petrodollars. So in the top left hand of the screen there, you can see a new local health centre that was constructed with oil money. The right hand side at the top, you can see a community event. This was a community football tournament, which again was received with money that came from oil. At the bottom left, the government embarked on these subsidised food stores so that people in poor urban communities could receive cheaper food that they would get in kind of private supermarkets. And again, this was using the overvalued currency to import food from places like Brazil and Colombia and then sell it at highly subsidised rates so that the poor could afford it. And then in the bottom right, you've got this new local bus service, which the local community themselves organised and then solicited the local government for funding. And again, this was oil money. Again, this was subsidised bus tickets, which meant that local people could travel to their places of work in the centre of the city at a much cheaper rate. It also gave employment to local drivers and ticket collectors, all of whom came from the community. So the money from that bus service was held by the local community. And the interesting thing was that alongside these kind of economic changes, there were very important political changes. You can see the bus in the back of this picture, and in the front there are lots of people raising their hands. They're taking a vote. And what they're doing is they're involving themselves in something called a communal council. And these were initiatives launched by the government in 2006, whereby communities of around 200 to 400 households could form together and form what they call this council. They would elect local people to be representatives, and those local people would then put together development projects decided by the community. They would then apply for money from the government, and this would be oil money, and use it to do things like improve the quality of people's houses, set up street lights, improve sanitation. These are kind of working class shantytown communities that have largely been built by people themselves, so they still have many material necessities that needed addressing. And again, so what you have is, alongside these economic changes, are really interesting experiments in what became known as participatory democracy. And it was really the oil money that allowed these experiments to take place. And it's also true that these impacts had a profound impact at kind of local and household level. I showed you this image a few moments ago of my family's house in Venezuela. So that's what it looked like from the back in 2009. By 2012, they'd been able to make many improvements to the house. They had put on security gates, they'd built a garage, they'd managed to do lots of decorations, they put coloured balustrades and all sorts of adornments to the house. And they'd also managed to buy a new car. Now, this family were an interesting family because they had become, they were political activists, pro-government activists, who then gone on to get jobs in the local government. And again, all of these jobs were really made possible by the circulation of petrodollars. So the period in which I first did research was quite an optimistic time for many people in this community, and a time in which people were getting new employment opportunities, were participating in local politics, and were generally seeing their lives as on an upward trajectory. Now, as you can probably guess from the title of this, unfortunately this period of social mobility didn't last all that long. In 2014, world oil prices dropped dramatically, and Venezuela, which really has its entire economy based around oil exports, falls into recession as a result. It's simply not getting as much money coming in because oil prices are much lower. Now, there have been many political problems, including the death of the former president Hugo Chavez and the election of his successor, Nicolás Maduro. And Maduro didn't manage this crisis well. The government tried to spend its way out of the problem, which just led to kind of hyperinflation. And because of this hyperinflation, the government could no longer import food and medicine to the same degree. And coupled with various political problems and complaints about the government, you then had a series of massive protests against the government, first of all in 2014 and secondly in 2017. And these were actually taking place when I went back to do further fieldwork in 2017. Now, the images you see there, particularly the one on the top right, these are known as guarimbas, where local youths would set up burning roadblocks in order to shut down the city. So when I was trying to do fieldwork in 2017, it was really difficult because everywhere I went there were these burning roadblocks. It was quite dangerous and quite scary. So I had to adapt my research to these new realities. And what you started to see because of these problems was many Venezuelans starting to leave the country. And this was really significant because Venezuela, as an oil-producing country, had always been, relatively speaking, more wealthy than many of its neighbours, and it actually had always been a receiving country in terms of migration. So you had many people from Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and other parts of Latin America had historically come to Venezuela. Suddenly you have a real reversal of this trend as Venezuelans start to leave the country looking for work and opportunities elsewhere. Now, this guy on the left is Guillermo, who is a very dear friend of mine, he's the son-in-law of the family I lived with, and became a good mate while I was doing my research, and has helped me a lot with my research. Now, this is an image taken from 2010, before the crisis hit, when Guillermo, who was, he was a working-class barrio man, he'd not always had the easiest time in his life, but at that point in time he had work. He managed to buy himself this new motorbike, which he absolutely loved, and he was pretty optimistic about how life was going. When the crisis hit, he lost his job, and like many millions of Venezuelans, he decided to leave the country, and he left for the neighbouring country of Colombia, which is where most poor Venezuelans have gone. But you can see from the graphic on the right here that since 2016, there has been millions and millions of Venezuelans have left for all parts of Latin America, and indeed in some cases to North America and to Europe as well. So at present there are over 4 million people who have left, possibly almost 5 million. That's about 1/6 of the population, the whole population of Venezuela. If you do it on working age, it could be as close as 1/3 of the population. So huge numbers of people have left. And as Guillermo said to me when I spoke to him recently, he said, what other choice do I have? There's no hope here. So it's a slightly depressing conclusion, and unfortunately the present reality in Venezuela is very much a depressing one. So if we think about this and we zoom back out, we can think about oil not just as a major pollutant and a contributor to climate change, but also an ambiguous substance in social and economic terms. And actually in Venezuela, it's also kind of an ambiguous substance in moral terms. People have quite a complicated relationship with their oil. They see it as both a blessing and a curse. For many countries in the global south, many post-colonial states, export-led economies produce contradictory outcomes. In times of boom, resource-rich states can invest heavily and improve the lives of their citizens in significant ways. And this was very much what I saw in the first period of my research in Venezuela. But without being able to diversify their economies, such states are extremely vulnerable to rapid downturns in their fortunes. Now, there's definitely been some quite serious mismanagement and poor governance in Venezuela. But it's also true that the odds are stacked against countries in the global south because of the unequal position they occupy in the global economy as a whole. And what happens is, as the image on the right here shows, is that ordinary people make their lives amid these shifting social, political and economic landscapes. So my good friend Guillermo was doing pretty well and felt like his life was going somewhere. He had a young daughter, he was building his own home. Then suddenly these global forces change and the rug is pulled from under him, and he suddenly has to adapt and leave the country and is now trying to kind of carve out a new life for himself in Colombia, but it's not easy. So these are some of the ways in which we as human geographers try and think about people's lives and the global economy across multiple scales. So we try and understand how these macro forces have very real micro impacts when you analyse things from the bottom up. So that's a little introduction into the kind of research that I do, and a sample of the kinds of research-led teaching you'll get at the University of Leicester if you choose to come and join us. So I very much hope that you will, and I very much hope that I will get to see you in person once this very strange period of history has passed. Thank you for listening, and take care.